Okay, I'm going to give a very quick history of the freak show and show you some of the ways in which freaks were packaged. It's important to note that the term freak does not describe people with physical deformities so much as it packages them for consumption. Right? And so when we talk about the freak show, we will be very interested in the way in which people with physical deformities or cultural deformities or novelty skills are packaged for consumer entertainment. Right. So freak shows have actually been around for quite a while. The first freaks were on display in dime museums in the 1840s. That's before the Civil War, as a frame of reference. P.T. Barnum was the master of these sorts of human displays. This is a picture of him here. A dime museum, as the name implies, was a very inexpensive museum, but it wasn't a museum in the way that we think about museums. Rather, it was a place that collected all sorts of variety entertainments and human oddities to display to middle-class consumers. It was a safe space for middle-class families to go for amusement, so it was one of the prominent forms of amusement in the 1840s. All right, so dime museums. This is Barnum's American Dime Museum and what it looked like in about 1870 or so. And notice the crowds that are milling around. These posters here would be advertising the sights that you could see inside, and often these were very titillating. They were designed to get people in the door. And then once they were in the door, the rhetoric was all about education, that this wasn't just about amusement, but also about edifying or instructing the public. So it was very much in keeping with those genteel ideals of what amusement should do. The freak show basically had 5 categories of freaks that would be displayed, or Bogdan says 4, but he collapses 2 of them together. But what he calls born freaks, there are actually 2 sets of those. One are what we might call the natural freaks, that is people who are born with physical or mental disabilities or handicaps. So Chang and Eng was one of the most famous early acts in the dime shows. Barnum discovered them and turned them into very wealthy men, actually. Albino families, people with hirsutism, or women in particular who could grow hair on their face. Other natural freaks, the fat people, quote unquote, who are often displayed in very infantilized ways. So Van Til Mack, the giant baby, for example, was a giant baby until she was well into her 30s. Other giant women in particular were described as Babe Ruth or Dolly Dimple, things like this, to set them off even further from the norm. We had giant people, we had little people, Tom Thumb being perhaps the most famous. Now, when Barnum discovered Tom Thumb, he was 5 years old. He presented him as an 11-year-old, and later he would actually have, before Tom Thumb was even 15 years old, Barnum would make him smoke cigars in front of the people to sort of certify his age, in a way. He also named Tom Thumb and gave him a title, General Tom Thumb, and often dressed him as Napoleon, as in this case. And this is one of those examples of what Bogdan calls the aggrandized status mode of presentation. And then, Isaac Sprague, the living skeleton, there's a physical condition behind this. It's not simply that he's starving himself, although they also did try to exaggerate the condition. Right. So you have your natural freaks. You have your what are called cultural freaks. Right. We can start to see the shift here between the natural and the cultural in human display if we look at the history of presenting giants on Barnum's stage. So you have Hugh Murphy, the Irish giant, Jack Shields, the Texas giant, Monsieur Joseph, the French giant. These giants are all associated with nationality in some way or with a cultural difference in some way. And it's interesting that when we come to the Chinese giant, he does not have a name. So there's a kind of exoticization, particularly of Asia and the Orient going on here, whereas Europe is simply being displayed as different sets of human beings. China seems to be slightly less human, and so the man does not even get a name. So natural freaks sort of blend into cultural freaks. Other cultural freaks were simply people with racial difference. So Barnum's Circassian beauties, who were said to be from the wild Russian Caucasus. Right? There's always this exaggerated language. Maximo and Bartolo, who were Mexican American, and Fiji Islanders were frequently displayed, often in native costume. They were often not allowed to dress in any other way, and when they were on stage, they had to perform with a certain kind of savagery that was expected of people from Africa. Perhaps most famous of these cultural freaks was Barnum's What Is It exhibit. This was around the time when Darwin's theories of natural selection were being popularized, and Darwin argued that that man was descended from apes, but the big question was, how did we get from ape to man? And there was this missing link. Well, Barnum claimed to have found the missing link, and he presented the What Is It as the missing link. This is some of the rhetoric that was used to frame this exhibit. Right, most interesting creature in the world. No one knows. No one is able to say what he is. Everyone admits him to be the most curious and interesting of all nature's wonders, being playful as a kitten and every way pleasing. Right, so he's not fully a man. He may be an animal, but if he's an animal, he's a docile animal who can be controlled. Now, interestingly, the What Is It exhibit was often played by a person with microcephaly. And microcephaly means small head, basically. So these were people who were born with a mental and physical deformity that also resulted in retardation. Zip the Pinhead was perhaps the most famous microcephalic, but Zip the Pinhead also is Schlitzie in Freaks, so you're going to get to meet this particular exhibit a little bit later when we watch Tod Browning's film. In addition to the natural freaks or the born freaks, you had the self-made freaks. These are tattooed men and women, people with piercings, Africans with plates in their lips, things like this, people who took their bodies and altered them in some way to turn them freakish. Novelty acts, people who had strange talents, right? Women handling snakes was a very popular one, or snake charmers in general. Sword swallowers, flame swallowers, those sorts of acts were novelty acts. When women performed these things, it was a little extra frisson, if you will, because, of course, women were not supposed to be participating in the public sphere at all, let alone handling dangerous equipment or dangerous animals, right? And then there were the Gaffed freaks, and Barnum was particularly good at this. That's what earned him the name the King of Bunkum, right? Gaffed freaks are simply fake freaks. So, for example, the four-legged woman, there's actually a little kid hiding behind the couch, sticking his legs out here, and that's where the other two legs come from. The Fiji mermaid was a famous Barnum exhibit. He took the skeleton of a monkey and attached it to a skeleton of a fish and said that it was a mermaid that had been found off the coast of Nova Scotia. You can still see it at the Maryland Dime Museum, by the way, and I put up a little clip that gives you a tour of that museum. It's one of the few dime museums left, and it does show what some of the exhibits would have looked like. The freak show is not just contained within the dime museums. It is actually sort of suffusing the culture. So expositions, human expositions, were a big feature of World's Fairs, for example. We talked a little bit about the Columbian Exposition, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the St. Louis World Fair, or Expo of 1904, had the first Native American exhibits, right? And these were arranged actually from relatively civilized tribes to relatively savage tribes, and so as you walked through, you kind of could regress through history. The savage tribes were from the plains, the civilized tribes were Cherokees and people from the east, right? So this is some of the exotica associated with these exhibits. The semi-civilized Navajo, we see them making things, we see them, creating rugs. But for the Pueblo snake dancers, they're a little more exoticized, a little less civilized. And as we get out onto the plains, that's where the Indian Wars are happening, and so those Plains Indians are particularly depicted as savage. The Columbian Exposition had the White City, as we know, which was the embodiment of genteel traditions and values and stressed education and edification. It was there to enlighten people about the best of modern society. But off on the side was the Midway, and in the Midway you could see the same kinds of exotic acts that you could see in sideshows. Particularly cultural difference was on display, and so you had people from everywhere, from Germany and France to Asia and Africa, and every night there would be a parade. Right, so these are some of the folks from the Samoan village. Notice again they have to be in costume. The White City is in the background here. There is a sheet that is protecting people in the White City from seeing these lurid sights out on the Midway, and people were dissuaded from going to the Midway, but of course it was the most attractive part of the fair. Most people just cut straight through the White City to get to the cultural freaks on the Midway. Little Egypt was one of the most popular acts on the Midway. She, of course, belly danced for people. And the Dahomey cannibals. This is an example of a kind of exoticized mode of presentation here. They're presented as savages. They're labeled cannibals and asked to act in a savage way. Coney Island gave freak shows a new home, and this is a shot of the entrance to Dreamland's Circus Sideshow, Congress of the World's Greatest Living Curiosities. And you can see the kind of hyperbole that marks these expositions. She's so fat it takes 7 men to hug her. So always exaggerating the physical deformities in some way. They had to be the biggest, the smallest, the tallest, the most unbelievable of all the world's acts. Even after Dreamland burns to the ground, the the proprietors of Dreamland simply charged money for people to tour the ash remains, right? So you can see these people gawking here, and they paid a dime for the privilege. But the sideshow is the first thing that they rebuilt, and that becomes what Dreamland is known for. It becomes a traveling sideshow, and it gets alive with circuses and travels throughout the country, and becomes probably the predominant way in which most people encounter freak shows from that point on. This is about 1910. So Barnum and Bailey's circus picks up where Barnum left off. His human exhibitions are simply folded into the circus sideshows with the animal tricks and all of that. So this is an advertisement for the Barnum and Bailey show with the world's largest, grandest, best amusement institution. Again, the hyperbole. Right? Peerless prodigies of physical phenomenon. A great presentation of marvelous living human curiosities. And we can see a giant, and we can see a couple of midgets here, a bearded lady, etc., etc. Strongman, conjoined twins. These were typical sideshow acts. And this is a smaller traveling circus. These regional traveling circuses were not the best place for freaks to be employed because they did not pay very well. It was very occasional work, and the routine was grueling. They would have to put on dozens of shows a day, in constant, continuous performance, and it was very taxing for people. So, on the other hand, they did get some pay at a time when there was no Americans with Disabilities Act to ensure that workplaces had accommodations, and when people were reluctant to hire people with any kind of difference, sideshows were still a place where people with those problems could find work. So they did get paid. They also found community in those spaces, and we'll see that reflected in the film, which takes a pretty sympathetic view of the freaks in the freak show. So on to Tod Browning's freaks. Tod Browning, the thing you want to ask yourself about is, what is his attitude toward these freaks? Is it in accord with what audiences from the early 20th century would have thought when they go to freak shows? Or is it a critique of those popular attitudes? What is he trying to say about the freak show? And you might start, before you watch the film, take a look at this poster. Right? And I'll put a copy of this up on the next block on the blend space. Take a look at the poster, and how is it framing your interpretation of the film? What kinds of expectations does it set you up with? And then when you watch the film, does the film seem to match these expectations? Right? Or something else going on? I'm also giving you a little piece by Amanda Klein, which talks about some of the production and reception history behind this film, if you're interested in how Warner Brothers came about producing it and how it was received. At the time, it was actually shunned pretty severely, and it only really found audiences in the 1960s. In the 1930s, it was a flop, basically, and she'll talk about why that is. Enjoy! It should be a lot of fun this week.